This is an x-ray of a grizzly bear that was shot with birdshot. It was also shot with what I believe was some sort of expanding round that broke its front leg. If you look closely, there are two major pieces of bullet as well as some lead fragments. In my opinion, the major piece on the right is a rather deformed part of the jacket, and the piece on the left is either part of the lead core itself or another piece of jacket. It's kind of tell from just an x-ray. Regardless, this is what we'd expect from a hollow point when it encounters thick bone. In comparison, this is all that was recovered from a .380 Winchester PDX-1 hollow point that was shot into the leg bone of a deer. It very easily broke and shattered the bone, but turned into fragments during the process. Likewise, this is a .380 Hornady Z-Max round that was shot into a deer leg bone. Both of these rounds significantly broke the bone, but had zero penetration afterwards. So if you have a medium-sized creature like a hog or a black bear, neither of these rounds are particularly good for defense against such threats, considering their lack of penetration through leg bone. For those of you who don't know, the Hornady Z-Max handgun rounds are just rebranded FTX bullets. We also have a .45 185 grain FTX bullet that was shot into half a cow leg bone, as well as a .380 FTX round that did the same. The results are that the .45 bullet mostly stayed together but shed its jacket, penetrating roughly 12 inches. In comparison, the .380's jacket stopped at the bone, and only a fragment of the core continued, making it roughly 12 inches into organic gelatin. The way I see this is that .380 is not a particularly good caliber if you're using hollow points against thick bone. It's possible that it might perform badly against smaller arm bones as well. Finally, a .38 Special FTX round surprisingly stayed together, expanded well, and seemed to be unaffected by the bone, penetrating roughly 12 inches. Jacket separation is actually fairly common for a hollow point that has traveled through a significant amount of bone. In another video, a Sig Sauer 180 grain 10mm round was shot into a cow leg bone and had its jacket stripped off. Just like with the X-ray, the reason that the jacket is usually recovered but not the lead core, that's because the jacket has a wide surface area and little mass, so it stops soon after impact with bone. The lead core itself in this video continued penetrating and was not recovered after passing through meat, ribs, and oranges. You may be asking yourself, why would anyone test ammunition in wood, for example, when hardcast lead will not break or shatter in wood, but will in thick bone? Part of the answer is that neither bone nor animals are completely consistent, so multiple shots can give multiple different results. In this case specifically, 3 hardcast 9mm rounds were shot through frozen beef and ribs. The first round completely penetrated through both blocks of clear gelatin behind the ribs. The second penetrated 23 inches and had basically zero deformation, and the last round had significant deformation and only made it 10¼ inches into the gelatin. Bone has different densities and thicknesses, obviously, so wood could easily represent bone that is not particularly dense, like the skull of a black bear, which, if you didn't know, is not hard enough to deform an average full metal jacket 45 ACP round. So if you wanted to directly compare a .357 SIG round to a 10mm round to test their overall penetration, it'd be wise to do so in pine boards instead of shooting them into a box filled with bones. Pine boards give more consistent results, so we can easily conclude that the 125 grain .357 SIG has more penetration than the 180 grain 10mm round. There was an experiment to determine which calibers and bullets would be suitable for killing large cattle. In this experiment, they used the front bone plate and rear bone plate of large cattle and put glycerin soap in between the two plates. They decided of the 4 rounds they tested, 3 were suitable for this task. The .357 Magnum Hornady FTX 140 grain Lever Revolution, the .357 Magnum 158 grain Federal Hydroshock, and the .38 Special Black Mamba 110 grain Full Metal Jacket. They also tested a .357 Magnum 158 grain Full Metal Jacket cellular and below round, and concluded that since it had reliably penetrated through the bone plates and soap, it was too dangerous to use on cattle because of the threat of overpenetration. Here are some CT scans for each of the rounds that they tested, so you can see the amount of bullet fragments that the hollow points left in the wound tract. The reason that the Hornady FTX and the Federal hollow point had such similar penetration despite the difference in weight is because they were both essentially reduced to fragments on impact. Keep in mind that this is a really significant amount of bone, and that's why these hollow points had such fragmentation. So if you don't want to have a bullet that will shatter on bone like hardcast lead might, and you still want deep penetration, you have a few options, the most obvious being a standard full metal jacket. You could also use either a buffalo bore solid copper monometal bullet or an extreme penetrator round. Monometal rounds are available in relatively few common calibers: 45 Colt, 10mm, 44 Magnum, and some larger calibers. However, I have to ask again, in what specific situation will you absolutely need a non-expanding round and maximum penetration? I've only found one case where someone actually needed to do this in self-defense, and it was because the bear turned away from him to face his dog, so he shot the bear lengthwise with a 45-70. I have talked at length why I don't believe you should be walking around with dogs in bear country, because they will provoke attacks from bears as well as moose. I want to stress the point that if you intend to shoot a bear only in the brain and not in the legs, you'd be better served by a solid copper or full metal jacket round. Expanding rounds can reach the brain, but they're not the best tool for the job. To illustrate this point, this is a case of one person shooting a black bear in the head 6 times with a .357 Magnum loaded with jacketed soft points. Not one of those rounds made it into the skull. Likewise, hardcast lead will also likely reach the brain. The skull is far thinner than a leg bone, so a bullet shattering on the skull itself is really not that likely. This is a quote from a person who describes that he used a 210 grain non-XDP Hornady hollow point in 41 Magnum to kill a black bear. He shot the bear twice. One round hit high in the left shoulder, and the second round went through both lungs and exited. The shoulder shot resulted in the bullet having jacket separation and core fragmentation, giving roughly 5 inches of penetration. The double lung shot resulted in far more blood loss and was obviously more effective. The round had higher penetration because lungs and ribs offer little resistance due to the low amount of flesh. Given when this happened, in all likelihood these were generic jacketed hollow points that Hornady doesn't make anymore because they've been replaced by better bullet designs. This is likely the ammunition that he used, and these rounds were shot into 20% ballistics gelatin. So in the situation that you are trying to shoot into the side of a bear that is on top of you, such a round will break the bear's shoulder or leg if you happen to hit it, but do relatively little else. If you miss the shoulder or leg, they're probably going to have sufficient penetration to inflict damage onto the vitals itself. This is a very specific, probably not very common either, worst case scenario that requires you to have poor ammunition, the bullets only impacting in areas with high resistance, thick muscle and bone, and the bear to be right on top of you. However, solving this problem doesn't require non-expanding rounds, as a durable expanding bullet can also be the answer. For example, you may shoot a 200 grain Hornady XDP round through the head and shoulder of an attacking bear and still get 16 inches of penetration. Given this is a 200 grain bullet, and he said he intended to use a 200 grain hardcast, I'm going to assume that this was either a 40 Smith & Wesson or 10mm handgun. Highlighted at the top, we have two 10mm 200 grain XDP rounds that were shot into 10% ballistics gelatin. Both of them have close to 16 inches of penetration. We also have some 180 grain loads for comparison. The point I'm making here is that ballistics gel is designed to represent animal or human flesh, and it accomplishes this very well. So even if you send a 200 grain round through a bear's skull and shoulder, it may still give you roughly 16 inches of penetration through bear flesh, just like it would if you shot it into roughly 16 inches of ballistics gel. This is a whole lot of rounds that were shot into ballistics gel. You can pause the video now if you want to take a good long look at it. I have a couple of points that I want to make from this. First of all, the top two sections of highlighting show that a Hornady XTP, Lever Revolution FTX, and a 180 grain jacketed soft point have relatively similar penetration and expansion. These rounds I'm talking about are all 44 Magnum, by the way. If the jacketed soft points were heavier 240 grain ones, they would have had more penetration. So the differences between jacketed soft points and jacketed hollow points can be somewhat minimal at these velocities as long as you are using specific hollow points. Generally speaking though, soft points have much more penetration than hollow points do. The lower section of the highlighting compares 240 grain 44 Magnum to 230 grain 460 Roland. Both bullets were of the same XTP design. However, the 460 Roland had far less penetration than the 44 Magnum did, despite the fact that the 460 had more energy. Part of the reason why this happened is because the larger original diameter of the 460, 45 caliber actually, resulted in far more expansion. The 44 Magnum had a smaller original bullet diameter of 429, so it expanded less and penetrated further. As much as I like semi-autos, I think 44 Magnum is clearly the better round for bear defense in this specific case. With somewhat similar barrel lengths, it has almost twice the penetration as the 460 Roland does. It's quite possible that with an extreme penetrator round, the results may be very different though. These are just the sources for all the information I just showed, and yes, it is in order. I want to mention a few more things. In one of Hickok 45's videos, he shot both 230 grain and 200 grain Underwood hardcast ammunition through a stock Glock barrel. The results were that the 230 grain bullets were not sufficiently stabilized due to Glock's polygonal rifling. In comparison, the 200 grain bullets were stable. Neither polygonal rifling nor hardcast ammunition is inherently bad. It's the combination of the two that causes problems. A similar sort of combination type problem can happen if you have a light, high recoiling rifle and very hot ammunition. What happens is every time you fire such a rifle, the ammunition in the magazine gets knocked around forcefully. So when you get to the last round of ammunition, the bullet may be forced significantly deep into the casing to cause both higher pressure and feeding problems. Again, it's neither the fault of the rifle or the ammunition, but a combination of the two can be pretty dangerous. A final example would be using really hot ammunition in handguns that don't have supported chambers, Glocks for example. With very hot ammunition, an absence of supported chamber means that the gun may detonate in your hands when fired. This is why I like to stress the fact that you don't need really hot ammunition, and consequently you don't need a supported chamber. Like I've said before, supported chambers can cause reliability problems in 10mm handguns, which is why Glocks don't have supported chambers. I also want to briefly talk about more of a hunting angle instead of a defense angle. This is a story of a guy who went black bear hunting in Ontario. He shot a black bear in the shoulder with a 20-gauge shotgun slug. The bear was never recovered, so obviously the slug never made it into anything vital. So after learning more about sectional density, he brought a 30-06, went back to Ontario, made the same shoulder shot on a black bear, and killed it. This 180 grain bullet went through one leg, the rib cage, went through another leg, and exited. The story was mostly centered around sectional density and why it matters. First of all, I want to say that sectional density is not entirely responsible for such different outcomes. You can choose to use a shotgun slug that has a lot of penetration. Penetration is the key term here, not sectional density, because a soft-lead expanding slug doesn't have a lot of penetration. Second of all, I don't think shoulder shots make much sense in this situation. If you're breaking a single shoulder, and the bear can run off with a single broken shoulder, you're not achieving anything meaningful. It's obvious that there is a downside to shoulder shots because they will prevent certain weapons and ammunition from actually killing the animal. I would go even farther and say shoulder shots unnecessarily increase the amount of meat that is wasted.